Welcome to the Savannah College of Art and Design very special edition of Guests and Gusto, SCAD's new virtual series of visits with influential creators and innovators. Today we are in conversation with Albert Watson. I'm Michael James O'Brien, the Associate Chair of Photography at SCAD Atlanta. And by way of a very modest introduction to Albert Watson and his work, I want to mention that Photo District News has mentioned him as one of the most influential photographers of all time. And he's also one of the great artists of the 20th and 21st centuries. Watson's first Vogue cover was in 1976, and his most recent Vogue cover was 2019. In between those years, he had over 100 covers of Vogues worldwide. He has done more than 40 Rolling Stone covers and photographed practically everyone that you've ever heard of, including Andy Warhol and Alfred Hitchcock, Johnny Depp, David Bowie, and Kate Moss. In addition, Albert Watson's work crosses almost every genre of contemporary photography, from fine artwork, conceptual portraiture, celebrity portraiture, still life, landscapes, of course, fashion, and documentary, as well as advertising campaigns for Prada, The Gap, Chanel, and Levi's. His work has been shown in major museums worldwide, including the National Portrait Gallery, the Smithsonian, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. His son, Aaron Watson, has told me that there are more than 1 million pieces of film in the Watson archive. We've managed somehow to select, with Aaron Watson's help, to about 80 of those images. We're going to share them now with you. And I want to welcome Albert Watson.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm happy to do this, happy that Michael's doing the interviewing. And it's a little bit of a sad time, of course, and I hope everybody's wearing a mask while we're doing this. But it is a sad time, a difficult time. But through the miracle of the technology, I'm happy to be speaking to everybody. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background. Some people will already know this, some will not. But as you can probably hear from my accent, I was born in Scotland. And I actually started in the Air Ministry down in London, working on a very primitive computer, plotting missile routes. So it was back in the late 50s, early 60s. And then I worked in a chocolate factory in a laboratory. And then finally, after going to night school for a year and a half, I had the choice to either do maths at university or go and do art up at St. Andrews at the Duncan of Jordanston College of Art. So I decided, I can't remember why, because I had the choice. And a lot of people said it was better to do math because then you got a job afterwards. But I decided to go up to Dundee and I began a 4-year course of art. And in the 4 years, for 2 years, the latter 2 years, I specialized in graphic design. And in the first of those 2 years, for the first time ever, they had a photography course. And I can only say that it was a remarkable kind of event when I first came in contact with photography. I became, right from the beginning, really obsessed by this. I had a very good teacher and I was fascinated. I'd never been in a darkroom in my life before. So it was fascinating to go out and take a picture, develop your film, of course it was film, and go into a darkroom and put that negative, process the film, put that negative later into the enlarger and make a print. And then to put this piece of white paper in a dish and an image came up, to me, it was just magic. So I became obsessed. Now, of course, at this point, I was given a very sound art education, and I had done everything from painting, drawing, silversmithing, pottery. I mean, just about touched a lot of different things, lino cutting, printmaking. And I became obsessed by printmaking. I just loved making prints. So I was there for 2 years. At the latter part of the 2 years, I won a scholarship to the States in 1966. So I was at this college for 4 years, between 62 and 66. And then I got a traveling scholarship with the IBM to come to the United States. And I toured the United States. I met a lot of amazing people. And I went to the design conference in Aspen. So these were formative years. And at the same time, I had got admission, which was not easy actually, to the Royal College of Art down in London. And I got in there, not to graphic design school, strangely enough, but film school. So I then did 3 years of film and television training. And it was completely, for me, absolutely, of course, beneficial. So at this point, you can see that I had an art training. I had a graphic design training. I loved graphic design. And then, of course, I kept up the photography wherever I could. And I then ended those 3 years. I got a master's degree in film. I had a lot of interesting people that I worked with. Tony Scott, the film director, was in my class. And so the interaction with other people, there were people from Oxford and Cambridge. So all of that was very formative and was part of my overall education. Then, fortunately, my wife got a teaching job in America, and I went in as her dependent. And then I kind of started. We arrived in Los Angeles. And basically, I was in Los Angeles between 1970 and 1976, and I moved to New York. By 1974, we had really the biggest studio in Los Angeles. And then I shut that down over 2 years and then opened a studio in New York. And that's where I am now. I'm still here in New York. So 76, after 6 formative years of just shooting everything from TV guide covers to hospital appliances, including bedpans, not as easy as you might think. And I ended up in New York. I eventually in New York, I had a beautiful studio here in New York, very big studio. And as I said, between 76 and the present day, I'm still working all the time. I'm still working, every day that I can. Things have slowed down here for obvious reasons right now. But that in a nutshell is what I've been doing. So essentially, I've been a working photographer now for 50 years, but in connection really with photography for 56 years. So of course, almost my entire working life has been with photography. And I'm just as obsessed by it today as I was when I first went into the darkroom. So, if you don't have that obsession and passion, then it's very difficult to really make it in photography. You have to have that drive, and every time you go out to take a picture, the adrenaline should start, and you should be your engine should be revved up. So anyway, that's a brief introduction.
Yeah, that's a lot of great points, Albert, that you made. And I think as we're looking at the slides, we can revisit, for example, the combination of the various kinds of work you've done. As you know, we've mixed it. So we're going to go from one period, one genre to another. I think also you've mentioned printmaking. And when we discuss this, I'd love to have you, as these pictures come up, talk a little bit to our students. I know that you still make prints yourself. You'll still go to the studio and work with a printer. So I think all that hands-on materiality is something that our students are returning to, which is a really optimistic moment. So as we go through, I think also your interest in graphic design and film looks to me, it's very apparent in the work that you've done. As all the way through the concerns of the lighting and the structure and the graphic elements in the picture. So maybe some of those as they're coming up. Are you ready to, shall we start?
Sure.
I want to mention also that there's going to be a lottery poll where students will be asked to have you comment on, tell a backstory. Their choices are Alfred Hitchcock, Andy Warhol, Steve Jobs, and Kate Moss. And the person whose question is chosen will have a chance to win your wonderful book about UFO, United Fashion Objectives, from '85. So that's going to come up, and we'll pose that question when that picture appears. Okay?
No problem.
Are we good?
Yep.
So here we go. We're rolling. So are we seeing full screen, Albert?
I do. I still have that poll question on my screen. I guess I'll take that off.
Okay.
Yep. There we go.
Yeah. Okay. Good. I'm gonna take it off too.
Okay.
So the poll question is there. All right, here we go.
This image is of the actress Julia Garner, and it was done for the Pirelli calendar. It was done in 2018 for the 2019 calendar. And I wanted really in that project, it's really a good example of how to approach a project. And I didn't want to just select 10 models or 10 celebrities or 12 celebrities and just do pictures of them in what I would normally do in a studio. So it would just look like one of my pictures, yes, but there was no scenario. So basically, we put together 4 women, and the Pirelli calendar had gone through a kind of a massive change. They were not, the calendar was famous for nudes and so on, and that they ended because it became too controversial for them as a company. So they very rarely do that now in recent years. So I decided to do this project where we took 4 women and we had them play a role somewhat different to who they are in real life as actresses, or and slightly not so different. We had Julia Garner, who was a young upcoming actress, and I cast her as a photographer and as a botanical photographer that lived in a simple house in the middle of a tropical forest. I shot it in Florida. And I did, of course, for her, I did all of her pictures. They were meant to be by her, but they were by me, of course. And she played this actress who was a photographer and was taking pictures, sometimes of people, but primarily of foliage, plants, still lifes, and so on. So it gave me the opportunity to cast her, and it gave me scenarios that I could put her in. Now, she didn't always have to have, for example, a camera, as you can see from this shot. She was just in a truck, and she actually has a truck. She drives a truck, so it was a perfect thing to put her in. And so she was cast as a botanical photographer, and this was one of the early shots that I did of her early in the morning down in Florida. And as each person had basically 12 images, and the total images in the catalog was 48 images. Wow. So we divided the year into 48, not into 52, as it were. And she was fabulous. The other 3 women were Misty Copeland, the dancer. Now, I cast her as a dancer, but as an up-and-coming dancer. So she, she lived in Miami with her boyfriend, and she was trying to make it and had dreams of becoming a great dancer, which of course she is. She's amazing. But it just enabled me to create another scenario. There was an actress model, Letitia Casta, and cast her as an artist, and I had Sergei Polinin, the
Amazing dancer, yeah.
amazing ballet dancer, Russian, Ukrainian actually, who was her boyfriend. So I wanted to introduce some men into the story, as I did with Misty. I didn't do that with Julia Garner. And then for the other model, we decided to use a model for the other one. And I was kind of against that, but after discussing things with her, I decided that it was the right thing to do. And of course, she played a reclusive character, and her best friend was Alexander Wang, the designer. So it basically, and I shot everything just for the photographers, obviously, probably it's mostly photographers. I shot it all on widescreen, like a CinemaScope, which made it more cinematic. And the whole presentation of the images was in the calendar was much more like a script, as it were. So it was, I give you all of that information because it lets you see how I would put something together, not just go and take a bunch of pictures of girls.
That was my question, Albert, that you actually build this scenario, you do the casting. How much are you involved with that? 90%, 100% working with a client to build this story and cast the people that you want to be in it?
I would say obviously I had a 51% say because I could just simply say I'm not photographing them. So, but nowadays, of course, Pirelli have a lot of smart people there. Yeah. The person in charge of it is very smart. And of course, they want to know, they go to social media and they want to know how recognizable the person is. They basically want a celebrity. So if you have a million hits on your Instagram, or 20 million or 40 million or whatever, then the more hits that they're getting in social media, then the more valuable they are. Because they do a big launch and everything, and therefore they get a lot of publicity. Well,
the Pirelli calendar has changed so much. I think Andy Leibowitz was the change that, and then Tim Walker, and then you. So that change from what you described before, I think has been culturally really, really relevant. We're going to see some of the pictures of Misty Copeland as we go ahead. I'm going to keep moving through some of the pictures that are going to come up. You may or may not have a story about, but if you want to identify them or say, because I've mixed them in so we can go through all the various aspects of your career.
And don't worry that that was just a more complex.
Oh, that's fantastic. We
more
love
complex project.
Okay.
It wasn't just a simple shooting.
No, I can imagine, and we're going to hear more about it. Here we go.
This is a picture that was done for the amazing Dutch designer Iris van Herpen, and she's an outrageous designer. And the dresses are kind of masterpieces of couture. And I mean, this is a thing just for the photographers listening. I mean, if you decide that you want to do fashion photography, you better love fashion. You better love, you should really begin to understand what couture is about, what pret-a-porter is about. You should be studying the history of fashion, all of these things. And to state something obvious, if you want to be a NASCAR photographer, you'd better be interested in cars. I mean, you know, you better have knowledge about cars. But unfortunately, fashion photography sometimes attracts people that just like the idea of the glamour of being a fashion photographer. And fashion photography is one of the hardest things to get into. It's not easy. Because if you're a reportage photographer and you say, I'm going to do a story on New York, you walk in the streets of New York, and you can do that every day. You can decide to start at 4 in the morning if you want. You can work until midnight or later. But when you're involved in fashion and you want to make an impact in fashion, you're faced with several problems here. You have to get a model, and then we better get a hairdresser. We better get a makeup artist. Well, I need to get some decent dresses. And then where am I going to do it? Do we need a van to change in a studio? And it goes on and on and on. And the more preparation you do, of course, the shooting is better. This was a very good model. I mean, we were talking earlier about the number of hits you get on Instagram. She has 48 million followers on Instagram. You know, so she was one of the models in the Pirelli calendar. She was the final model. And Gigi Hadid is
She's amazing, yeah.
She's kind of an amazing model, you know. She's quite difficult to control, and you have to be assertive, because otherwise you don't get pictures like this. So you have to have a presence here, you know. I was also lucky enough, I flew in a hairdresser for this from London, Kerry Warren, and he's a sensational hairdresser, one of the best ever that was ever a hairdresser. So I'm just emphasizing those who want to do fashion. All of these things are important.
I think a lot of our students will take very good advice from this, and they're aware of, I think, the changes in the world of fashion that we're all going through. We've been going through these before the current lockdown. I want to mention something that you brought up in this about someone being a bit difficult to control. You're very, very known for your generosity and your spirit of optimism. Have you ever had a situation where you've had to get tough or put your foot down with a client or a model? You don't have to mention who it is, but have you had situations like that where you really had to exercise your control over the situation in some extreme way? Or has it always been very lovely collaboration and smooth sailing?
Well, I'm not a violent person.
Good.
But if I had a gun, I would have shot Chuck Berry.
Uh-oh. Oh my gosh. Oh no.
He was a nightmare, and I was the world's biggest Chuck Berry fan. So I mean, that's kind of odd. Like, you go there and you treat him like he's a god, and he was just a nightmare. It was horrible. I went down to New Orleans to photograph him for Rolling Stone, and I was excited to do that. And he said, "I'll only let this photographer photograph me if he comes to the airport and picks me up." So I said, "Okay, that's fine. I can do that." And so we had a limousine booked, the Rolling Stone booked, and I went out to the airport. So he said, "Is that my car?" You know, I met him. He said, "Hello." And that was it. Hello. And he said, "Is that my car over there?" I said, "Yes." So he goes over to the car. And of course, I assumed, you never assume in this business. I, of course, assumed that we were going to ride back in New Orleans together. So he got in the car and closed the door and took off. So in other words, I was left at the airport. So all I did was say, "Hello, yes, that's your car." And then the shooting only went downhill from there.
Oh my gosh.
So I mean, that's just, and the story goes on and on. Believe you me, it gets worse and worse. But that's, you know, when it gets that bad, there's not a lot you can do. You just kind of, you kind of hit a shutter and run, you know. So sometimes it's impossible.
Let's go forward in a good way. Here's another. By the way, Albert, Iris van Herpen had a wonderful exhibition here in Atlanta at the High Museum. And they had 2 floors, incredible clothing. So there's a little bit of back history with this clothing in Atlanta as well.
Right, and this is also an Iris van Herpen.
Yeah, that's why I'm saying that, yeah.
Dress. And I wasn't crazy about this model, the way she looked, because the people from Iris had recommended her, and I said, okay. Then she came in, and she was very nice. But in the end, she wasn't right for what I wanted to do. So I just did this picture and, of course, blacked her out, as you can see. However, it makes a dramatic picture, of course, this technique. I'd used this technique before. The first time I used this technique, I just found it by accident. I was photographing in Palm Springs, Naomi Campbell, the model, many, many years ago. And it was just so hot out there. It wasn't the height of the season, the summer, but it was hot. And the makeup was having, makeup artist was having problems. She was sweating and so on. And I just took a flag to basically protect her from the sun, so that it wasn't so hot.
We've got that picture coming up, Albert. We're going to see.
Oh, you do. So then you've got the
wonderful picture. We're going to bring that up.
And so that's where that came from. This is a
very different series. Yeah.
Very different series altogether. This started as I was kind of a big fan of two things. I mean, like the rest of the world. The Mozart, the Magic Flute by Mozart. Mm-hmm. The strangeness and the obscurity and the weirdness of that, it was so eccentric and wonderful. The story and the birds and it was so strange. And I was also a fan of A Midsummer Night Dream by Shakespeare. Now, I mention this because these are just ways things can inspire you. Yeah. As you see behind me, I have 6 libraries. There's the smallest one, which is quite long. You can't see all of it here. I'm a big fan of books, as you can see, and I have a library here. I have another huge one upstairs in this apartment. And so I love the inspiration of other people's work, and it can be music, it can be it can be Shakespeare, it can be theater. And Midsummer Night Dream, which we did a series called Dreamscape, and I just loved this idea of kind of in the woods and wildflowers and I had prepared some pictures when I had done, which you'll see later, I think, the Sky Project. Yeah. But I had taken some pictures there that were very simple, just textural pictures of grass and trees. Nothing.
Yeah, just so our listeners know, yeah.
Yeah, that were just simple textural pictures of foliage, basically. And I had always planned to use these later in this project. Mm-hmm. So I just built a library of those. And I wanted to basically do a series of layered images where I took a basic image and then began to work on it with layers and layers and layers. Sometimes granular layers, sometimes paint. I worked with very good makeup artists to create this whole series. I don't know if you have any more coming up.
I do. They're great. It's amazing.
But you can see for the photographers, the basic questions I sometimes get from photographers is, well, how did you know how to do that? How did you know how to do that? And I think I kind of basically just told you, I'm looking for inspiration all the time, trying to come up with an idea, trying to think about how I'll do this and how I'll put it together and how can this be interesting? And of course, sometimes the young photographers, they say, oh, I prefer to be spontaneous. Now, to be spontaneous, you can be. I mean, I try to be spontaneous myself, but to be spontaneous, if you want to create pictures of this level and you're just spontaneously doing it, then, we're back to Mozart. You got to be Mozart to do stuff like that. And Mozart, of course, from the age of 2 or something, was put through a military musical academy by his father. And therefore, the combination of natural ability plus all of that training, he eventually got to something where he could just sit down and write something outrageous. So the same thing with photography. The more you shoot, the better you get. The more you analyze your work, the more you shoot, the more constructive you are in the planning, and then the more constructive you are after you receive the pictures.
One of the things that we really encourage, putting it mildly, our students to do is to talk about the work. And I feel if you can talk about it, you are motivated and you understand it, and putting all these elements together. I think one of the amazing things about your work as we go through is the way you've combined all these techniques, some of which weren't even invented in 1975. And the combination of you using film and all these digital and post-production processes is amazing. So we're going to see more of that as we go through. This is a classic one, I think, really classic. Is it Cindy Crawford?
That's Cindy Crawford.
Of course, you see the mole. No one else has a mole like that.
No, I do, but you can't see it under my beard.
Say what? Okay.
I said I have a mole under this beard, but you can't see it.
I have some below right now. Okay. This is from your Pirelli series, and I thought this an extraordinary picture of Misty Copeland, who you mentioned before. So you can see a little bit, our viewers can see the way in which you positioned Julia Garner, Misty Copeland into these various stories. But this is an amazing picture. Did you do it in the studio in Miami?
No, I did it in the garden. And I simply just put up a backdrop and I did it in the garden. So it's a combination of some strobe, a very low angled strobe, as it were, on the right hand side. But the majority of it's natural light, and it was plenty. It was Miami, so it was very bright.
Yeah, always.
You know, here's another example of kind of planning. Where did the hula hoop come from? You know, you need to plan these things. Otherwise, a hula hoop doesn't just drop out of the sky. Now, you may get lucky and there may be one sitting in the garden, but usually not. So, of course, I brought the hula hoop because I thought that it would be an interesting device for her just to do, rather than just continually do dramatic pictures of her dancing. And there were so many of those pictures that you can find online, thousands of pictures. I wanted to create something that was, of course, graphic. And remember, I set myself a very difficult task here, which as I went through the project, became a nightmare. It was very hard for me. And even with all of my knowledge, was a cinemascope screen, that panoramic. It was kind of tough. But here you can see that it's a pretty good use of a panoramic.
But there's no distortion either, Albert. It's an amazing setup, the way that you've done it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that you do, you know, and speaking to young photographers, there's a lot of things you do when you get to my grand old age that you, of course, have 55 years of experience. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean then you say, well, I've done it for 55 years, so it's, you know, I think if you've been flying a 747 for 55 years, as it were, you don't want to get too cocky and just say, okay, we won't do a check, we'll just take off. I think you still have to really plan things, but you have the advantage of a lot of knowledge, a lot of knowledge.
Absolutely.
And if you look at this picture here, that picture, this one and this picture here, think about what I said earlier, the introduction, graphic design, graphics. Yeah. So, I mean, I would invest for a photographer, invest in a couple of good books on graphics, on graphic design. And you should enjoy it. If you really want to be a photographer, you should enjoy graphic design.
Because our students do a lot of graphic design work. It's one of the disciplines that works naturally at SCAD. I've got a student now I'm working with who's a graphic design major, doubling in photography. I find these things come in really well. This is one of your classics. What year would this be from, Albert? Do you remember?
This would be approximately 89.
Yeah, it looks complete.
And it was actually done at my old school, the Royal College of Art, the sculpture school.
Wow.
Just a piece of trivia, the head of the Royal College of Art Sculpture School was Henry Moore, the sculptor.
Oh my gosh.
And
amazing.
And anyway, I got permission to go in. It was just at the end of the year, and the students had just had their final year show, and it's actually part the studio spaces were part of the Science Museum and the Natural History Museum in South Kensington in London. And so they all had skylights. So this is just natural light. And this was just a piece of luck. I went into this studio space, and just pinned on the wall, left over from an exhibit that had been taken down, was a piece of black cloth just hanging at that height, high up, just where it was. I didn't have to pin it there or do anything with it. The dress is a Yohji Yamamoto dress. And it was actually quite funny because it was the first shot I did that. And the magazine had gone to great expense to fly the model in from New York. And of course, when I did this shot, the editor was a bit angry and said, we have to see her face. We just flew her in from New York, first class. So I said, the shot is just too good, you know, graphically not to do, you know.
Yeah,
but sometimes you get lucky.
Speaking of, one of the classics that our students are writing in about. Tell us the story behind this, can you, Albert?
Right, yeah. At this time, I was an LA photographer. This is 1973.
Wow.
And 74. It was that right at that period. And I was an LA photographer, thinking about moving to New York, but I was an LA photographer. And the phone rang, and it was a very, very nice person on the phone, super nice. Turned out to be the art director of Harper's Bazaar. And Ruth Ansell was her name. And she was fantastic. And she said, we'd like you to photograph somebody famous. I can't tell you who it is. Can you do it? And of course, I was like, wow, Harper's Bazaar magazine. You know, back then that was like,
yeah,
wow, a fashion magazine from New York calling me at my studio. So later that day, they called back and they said, it's Alfred Hitchcock. So of course, at this point, I almost fainted. You have to remember, I was just out of film school. So Alfred Hitchcock was like somebody that maybe didn't even exist. It was just a name, you know, it was just a remarkable person. And they said, very few people know that he's a gourmet chef and he loves cooking. And he's going to give us the recipe for his Christmas goose, how to cook it. And in fact, the actual title that ran above this picture was Alfred Hitchcock Cooks His Own Goose. So it was a good heading. So they said, can you do that? And I said, yeah. And they said, well, we'd like to have you shoot him holding a plate with a cooked goose on it. And I said, okay, that's fine. Of course, I would have done anything. You know, if they'd asked me to have him juggling or something, I would have done that. And so I thought about it overnight and I called him back and I said, I think it's funnier if he hasn't cooked it yet, but in a way it looks like he strangled it himself. And they said, well, that's interesting. And I said, I'll still shoot the plate for you, but if you, I thought this was a good way to do it. We can always get two goose, or it's not two gooses, but two geese, whatever, two geese. And so they called back and they said, the editor loves the idea. And then I said, well, to make it a little bit Christmassy, if you look carefully there, you can see there's actually some Christmas decorations. I shot it in color and black and white. Back in the day, that's what you did.
Yeah.
And so I put some Christmas decorations around the goose's neck and went to Universal Studios, it was, where he had a cabin there with an office in it. And we emptied his little conference room there. And remarkably, he walked by the window and I saw his silhouette on the window, just like he does in the show. I saw it. It was incredible. And I thought, oh my God, that's him. So he walked in and he was super nice to me. He said, oh, he said, you don't sound American. And I said, no, I'm not, you know, sort of thing. And we actually got on very well. And he was, of course, fabulous. I think he saw that I was nervous, but he was absolutely, he was fabulous. I mean, he just helped me and so on. And it was not easy to do the goose was heavy. So it looks like it, you know, he made it look like he's holding onto something that was 1 pound. It was actually pretty heavy. And he just did all these things, and he pretended, you know, to cry. And then he was saying to me, he began to cry and say, I don't know if I can do this, and so on. So he was fabulous. And then at the end of the shooting, he said, you look like you could do with a nice cup of tea. And I ended up in his office with having a cup of tea and shortbread biscuits, and his discussing film. And I told him I was at film school and so on. So the whole thing was a remarkable experience. And the picture for me was a great success.
Yeah.
And they called me back and said, have you ever thought about doing fashion? And I said, well, I do some catalogs out here and so on. And they said, well, we'd like you to shoot fashion for us. So that was basically, in some ways, a career-changing moment.
Albert, I'm going to move forward a little bit. So, because the write-in from the students was to ask for your story about Andy Warhol. So maybe we'll move through some of these. There's so much work.
This is a model called Ducky. It's quite recent. I think it's 2018.
Yeah.
Maybe 2019, excuse me, 2019. And that's a Gautier outfit. It's a great dress. I had very good hair and makeup people. I still had Kerry Warren with me. And I had the makeup artist Ayami, who was very, very good. And this is just another way of you looking at the graphics and then deciding on lighting. I mean, lighting is its own nightmare, you know, that you have to get over, unfortunately. So we won't discuss that just now.
We'll come into that.
We'll come into it. Here's another Iris dress. So what you've got here, you've already got 5 or 6 shots that are from basically the same shooting that is Iris Van Herpen dresses. Yeah. And they requested me to do the pictures because she has a book coming out. And this is just a remarkable dress. I mean,
yeah.
And another one. So what you've got here is a series of you know, dresses. Here, the makeup artist, it's just what somebody can give you. I don't know if you can see if you're all on small computers or iPads or something. But I said that this almost looks like an insect. And right away, the makeup artist created from something he created these wonderful lashes on the girl. Fantastic makeup artist called Kabuki.
They're amazing.
And he just, and the minute I saw that, I said, it's fantastic. And I shot her in profile, so the curve of the eyelashes kind of echoed the curves in the dresses and underlip. But basically, these are very simple. The lighting here, to make it slightly more unusual, and you have to try and make the picture slightly different as you go through this. This is underlit, so the light is below waist level to get that effect.
This is one of the famous. I've got 2 back-to-back, and I want to show you these both so you can talk about this one, and then we have that one. So I think the combination is very interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about this picture and then the following one as well?
Sure. I mean, it is quite interesting because this is 100% natural light. Basically, it was done in January outdoors in Marrakesh. So Marrakesh in the evening time is cold, but in the daytime, the temperature is about 75 degrees. It's quite comfortable. And Cape Moss was beginning to be well known at that time. The picture is 1993, I believe. And she was very, very nice, super English girl, you know. And I worked with her that day for, which is going to sound like an exaggeration, it wasn't 16 hours. And they were going to do a whole kind of beauty issue for German Vogue on her. They used this shot on the cover. And interestingly enough, the pose I gave her here, I just said, imagine you're, you know, like a wood nymph or something like that, you know, and crouching, about to spring out, you know. And then I noticed with the feet and the hand, you know, when she was talking to me, and I just laid the hand, as I put the hand in front of you, just in front of the foot. And just, I was very lucky with the light, because although it was sunny, the sun was dropping into some haziness, and she was able to look straight at it, you know. And so consequently, this is natural light. I have a canvas in the back garden of a house there. And we started hair and makeup at 7 o'clock in the morning, and we worked till 10. And I have to say, we did a lot of pictures, a lot of pictures. She was very easy to shoot. And then after 5 o'clock, we then went indoors. So if you go to the other one, then in this dining room of the house, I created a studio. And it's actually the same backdrop as the other one. Wow. I just, you know, the way you light it. Yeah. And when I had gone in to check the lighting for the frontal shot of this, she had her hand resting. No, it wasn't the frontal lighting of that. It was the frontal lighting from the strobe, because this is strobe lit. And I noticed her hand just pulling slightly on her leg, and there's an indentation there, which you know, if you have small screens, you might not see it, but just where the fingers are, I love the indent. Yeah, you could feel the fingers pressing and holding on to the body, not just posing, letting the hand drop there, but that wrapping the hand around and put. So the focus of the shot not necessarily became her spine there, which is a focus, but the focus of the shot, which really interested me, was the hand. Yeah. And the hand, just the way it was perfect. Strobe lit, and both these shots, the last one and this one, are Hasselblad. This is Tri-X film, and the other one is Tri-X as well.
That's amazing. Very different. We may move a little more quickly, but I want to...
Sorry, the stories are maybe too long.
No, they're wonderful. Not at all.
Well, some of these can go by fairly quickly.
Okay.
This is careful portrait lighting, quite classic. You know, I'm fairly careful with shadows. Most people are looking for highlights, which I look for, of course, but I'm really interested in the height of light, you know, where the light is, how high it should be. You know, I'm always amazed. I work now, I sold my big studio. And when I work in a studio, I work in a place where there's maybe 14 other photographers. And I'm always amazed when I see them working, that they put the light there in the morning and the light never moves all day. They just leave the light there. So they don't do any lighting. The light's there to light the ground. That's it. That's what the lighting is. And they never move the light. So, I mean, in a way, that's a bit sad for me. Of course, I love the lighting, doing lighting, because I feel that I've seen what light can do. You can transform people. You can make them look almost innocent sometimes, and you can make them look sinister. You can make them look heroic. You can do many things with lighting.
No, incredible, of course.
So here, the light on the person is important, but then crucially, the value of light behind. So when the light goes, when you look at this picture here, of course, most people in an image like this, you go to the warm spot. I knew you were going to be drawn. I'm shooting fashion here. I knew you were going to be drawn to the color, and I made sure the color in the actual outfit, the sweater was a little bit deeper, so the white was bigger. So I cheated a little bit and made the collar a little bit narrower. So there wasn't much white. So you're drawn to that. You have a highlight on the nose and the forehead, but then I'm usually fairly careful with what the background is doing, and your eye hits kind of him and the collar and him, and then there's something for your eye to go through the picture to carry you on, which is the density of the background on our right side, the right side of the picture there. And I slipped a flat in there just to give it a little bit more dimension. So just when you're analyzing these things, you know, and if you're doubtful about it, you slip the flat in and you take it out. You know, you do have some flexibility there.
Now, Albert, I've been told by our leader we have about 5 minutes, which is insane, before student questions. I want to go through.
All
I'd
right,
love
let's go
to
through
show
some
them
pictures.
all. Yeah, because there are so many amazing. I'm just going to move through
Sure,
these.
50 cents for
Back.
Rolling Stone. He was the most professional rapper, hip hop guy that I ever photographed. He was the most professional. If he was due at the studio at 10 o'clock, he arrived at 9:30.
Wow.
I mean, I've done rappers that were due there. I've actually done rappers that were due there at 5 o'clock and never turned up.
Yeah.
And at 1:30, my answering service called me and said, you know, there is a rapper on the phone. I won't give you the name. And he said, he's standing outside your studio. But he was fabulous.
That's great. Let's move a little bit through
Sure.
some of these, and then when the questions, these are amazing. These are very new pictures, aren't they, that I'm showing now?
That's new. That's Japanese Vogue.
Yeah, 2019, no?
That is 2019, yes.
These are part of that
That's
sequence.
part of the dreamscape, the Midsummer Night Dream.
Amazing.
That's one of the pictures that was done in Sky, and that's a nude taken, obviously from the back. That was a perfect place to kind of basically project this one.
Colors, yeah. This we're going to talk about for a second. The lottery, the student that asked the question won this. So can you tell us about this picture of Andy Warhol?
Well, you know, Andy was desperate to be a model. And he was represented by Zoli Model Agency.
Yeah, I remember.
To do a job. You could book him to do a job. And, you know, he preferred doing editorial, of course. And this was editorial for German Men's Vogue. And it was a series of glasses. And they thought Andy Warhol would be good for it. He loved the idea of posing, wearing glasses. And he brought me, he was hysterically funny. I mean, he just made you smile the whole time because he was so dry sense of humor. And you never knew when he was being serious or joking. And of course, he was a genius. And he arrived and he took out of his pocket a picture of Arnold Schwarzenegger as the Terminator. One of the movie poster outtakes, you know, kind of thing. And he said, he had this soft, funny kind of voice, kind of very soft. Can you make me look like the Terminator? You know, so I mean, and that's what might feel a little bit of a stretch, you know, you as a Terminator. I said, but let's give it a crack, you know. And we had a leather jacket that was painted that I had left over from another shooting. And he put that on and he gave me this look, you know, which is Andy Warhol pretending to be Arnold Schwarzenegger as the Terminator. So, I mean, sometimes you get help by people. I mean, that was not my idea, it was his idea. I took the picture. I knew to shoot it from a heroic angle. And the way to do the lighting, how to solve the problem with the light and the glasses and things like that. I could do that. But that's how that picture came around.
That's fantastic. Let me move through a little bit.
Miyake.
Yeah, for interview, unbelievable. Recent again, wasn't this also very recent, Albert?
Well, this is recent. Now, one thing you understand about pictures like this, when you talk about planning, ideas, and so on, this is the designer Noir, which is an offshoot of Comme des Garçons, also Noir. Yeah. And these are basically when it doesn't make sense to give, when you're going to be doing 20, 40, 60 pages for a magazine.
Wow.
That almost never happens now, but it did happen here. Because of the costs nowadays, and magazines have no money anymore. That is finished, you know. Basically, you're doing a shot every 20 minutes, by the time, and sometimes less.
Mm.
because you have to do so many shots per day. I shot this in Tokyo for Japanese Vogue.
Beautiful. Bowie.
Mhm.
Catherine Deneuve. This
That's
is,
a very old picture.
it's amazing Vogue cover. Such a beauty.
Almost the same heroic
Yeah.
as the Andy Warhol, if you look at that. Christy Turlington.
Yeah.
That's part of the Midsummer Night Dream series. This was another series I did. I did a series of nudes. This obviously isn't a nude, where I used plus size models. They were big girls, you know, and I gave them these girls worked a lot, but they did a lot of catalogs and things like that. And of course, they would never be booked for Vogue magazine or anything like that. So, of course, when they came into my studio and I began doing pictures like this of them, it was one of the most rewarding things I ever did. They were astonished. This was actually shot on 4x5 color film, you know, Ektachrome.
Fantastic.
And but when they saw the Polaroids, they almost didn't know it was themselves, you know, because nobody had shot them like that before. Most of the time, they were just standing there with their hand on the hip. So this is a layered picture again. It has a grain screen on it that I made. And of course, it was scanned. And I wanted to give the picture in the printmaking almost a slight Xerox to it. And that comes to the printmaking part. But of course, I was using, with this, it was not cosmetic lighting, but it was the same kind of lighting that usually I use on men, really. So it's a strong light, but I actually love this shooting. You know, that back one, I'll tell it very quickly. That I was photographing for the Gap, and this child was there. I photographed him. He was 5 years old.
Oh my God.
And I saw his face. I thought, oh my God, that child is just stunningly beautiful. He had jet black hair. And I spoke to him and I spoke to his mother and I said, can he come back at 5 o'clock, you know, 5:30? I'd love to do a picture of him. And then I asked him and he said, okay, you know. And I came back and I held the makeup artist there and she had a gold body spray, and I sprayed his black hair so that it was gold, silver gold, and sprayed him. And that was taken on an 8x10 camera with a standard lens. That's the full frame. And I only got 4 frames of him. And then he said, I've had enough, can I go home? You know, so it was too much for him, you know. Yeah. But I got this picture of him, which is one of my favorite pictures I ever did. It's so simple. It's like a passport picture, but not really.
Like a what?
It's like a passport picture, but not really. You know?
But it looks like one of those statues you see in the Archaeology Museum in Istanbul. They're extraordinary, the eyes and the light. Boy, do I hate to keep moving. Mick Jagger.
Yeah. Mick Jagger. Yeah. Incidentally, Keith Richards.
Another. This is Dream.
This was from the Midsummer Night Dream series, and I do a lot of work with paint and inks, and I was well into this in the late 80s and the 90s. In fact, if you look at the front or the back cover of Cyclops, the first book I did, you can actually see this. Oh, wow. I'm working with inks like this. So therefore, when the computer came along, for me, after being in the darkroom for 45 years at that time, 40 years, and then the computer came along, and you put me on a computer, then it was a match made in heaven for me. Because I just saw 5 million possibilities, and I was never sucked into the computer when it became too artificial. I'd never sucked into that. It just looked cheap to me. You know, when you use computer effects. So the trick was, how do we work with this device and make it look analog? You know, that was basic idea. But I mean, computers outrageous.
King of Morocco, another Misty Copeland, incredible from Pirelli, the Monkey series.
Again, now this was not done in the computer. This was
Yeah.
done with inks, and done the way it was done. I made an 8x10 of this image on a piece of film, then put the film in a light box, and then put a piece of acetate over the film, and then put ink all over the acetate, and then revealed the face of the monkey by just simply wiping away the ink, and drawing. You can see there's drawing above the head. And I just drew on the ink at the top of the picture, and then with a 4x5 camera, rephotographed it. So that was done analog.
I think that one of the best things that you're talking about, Albert, is the effect that it has on all the material we have, all the technique, and our students within the 4 years are able to do all these things, but basing it in film and moving over to computers, it's such an interesting story. We'll talk about him later. This is the Naomi picture you talked about where her face is in profile.
Exactly, and that just came out. I put a flag with a boom, just over her to protect her from the sun. But of course, I saw the silhouette. I thought, bingo.
It's incredible. Albert, we have questions. I want to go through these. Do you want to tell the Steve Jobs story? Then we may have to move to our student questions.
I'm happy. I'm desperate. I'm bored with myself here.
No, we're not. I'm so fascinated. I could do this for hours. We have to book a second round. But tell us the Steve Jobs story, and then we're going to go to.
Sure, I think it's quite well known, but I'll go ahead and tell it. They had asked me to photograph him out in Cupertino, and I kind of figured he was going to be not so easy. But I thought, okay, what can I do? And one thing we did do, he was due to be photographed at 9 o'clock. So the first thing was I really pushed hard.
9 a.m.
9 a.m. 9 a.m. Sorry. And so I pushed to get in there at 6:30. And of course, by the time it came to 5 to 9, of course, we were gigantically tested. The electricity was tested, everything, So we had, we were totally prepared. And the PR guy came in and said, "Oh, hi, Mr. Watson. I went, just to let you know, Steve really hates photographers." and I said, "Well, I can't, I'm a photographer. I'm sorry he doesn't like me already, but," and so he said, I just thought that was important that you know that. And so in those 5 minutes, it was actually a stroke of luck, because in those 5 minutes, I thought, I wonder how I can make him not hate me, sort of thing. And then he walked into the room, and I had something prepared for him. I had questions prepared for him, but I had something prepared for him. And I said, he said, "Hello, how are you?" I said, "Fine, happy to be photographing you." And I said, "I have a piece of good news for you." And he said, "Oh, really? What's that?" He was a bit gruff. And I said, "I only need you for 30 minutes, not an hour." And his face lit up. He said, "Really?" He said, "I am so busy." He said, "That's fantastic." And he patted me on the arm. And then he had to look around the room, and he kind of looked, there was a mark on the floor where he should stand. So he thought, "Oh, okay, things are prepared for me." And then he saw a camera, and he said, "Oh my God, you're shooting with an old camera?" I was shooting film. It was shot in 4x5 film. And he said, "Why are you not shooting digital?" And I said, "Well, I just feel that digital's not quite there yet." 2007.
For you.
And I said, "I think it's not quite there yet." And and then he said, "I agree with you." And then he pointed at me, and he said, "But," he said, "we're going to get there." He said, he's saying we the digital generation are going to get there. And I did the shooting. I did kind of basically from waist up, and then I did this close-up shot of him. He was very interesting to photograph because he never blinked.
Yeah.
In front of the camera, you never saw his eyes ever close. So when you look at there weren't that many frames because it's 4x5, but you don't see him blink at all. Then at the end, he picked up the Polaroid, the 4x5 Polaroid that was in a mask, and he picked it up, and he said, "Wow," he said, "that's maybe the best picture ever taken of me." And I thought, okay, now he's being nice to me. He's just being, he's being nice. And I thought, "Oh, thank you." And he said, "Can I have this?" I said, "Sure." And then he shook my hand and said, thanks again. And, and he left. He left at 25 to 10.
Wow.
And I never heard any more about it. The magazine loved the shot. And then years later, there was a call from Tim Cook that said we needed that shot of Steve Jobs. I said, I can give it to you tomorrow. He said, I need it now. And I said, let me see if I can get it. It was already 5:30 in New York. And we then set it up and did the, prepared it for them, and we sent it out. Then I was at a Lincoln Center event that night, and my phone buzzed at just before 8 o'clock. And there was the Steve Jobs memorial shot. He had died that day.
Oh my God.
So that's why, and he wouldn't tell me. I said, I can send it tomorrow. He said, no good. He said, and so in the end, I thought, well, Steve obviously did like it, Sure.
That's amazing story. I never heard it. Albert, at this point, I've got about another 50 pictures to look at for when round two, if we're still in quarantine. I want to switch over to our students' questions.
Sure.
And, they're coming up. Let me pull up the first one, Albert. So I have a question. We're going to start. Do we have our questions coming up? I'm looking on the chat, and Q&A is here. Okay, so from Carlos Colon, when you describe needing to have that passion or that drive, discipline perhaps, in order to be a photographer, what did it mean for you specifically in more practical terms? This is a good question. Can you speak to the trade-offs that you feel you made in order to live on those terms?
Fab question. There was a dark side to that kind of level of intensity and passion and work. And I never went to my son's graduations. Is a typical example. If they had, a soccer game, I wasn't there. A little bit in the beginning I was, but later it just never happened. So there was a lot of shortcoming because I was always working. Yeah. I was simply always working. And the longest period that I haven't intensely worked, I'm in right now. I never had this my entire life before, where I've had basically in 4 weeks, we shut down the studio, but in 4 weeks, I've only worked 2 days in 4 weeks. I never in my life had that before. Wow. I never took long holidays. And a lot of time on holidays, I had books with me to study for things I wanted to do after the holiday was finished. So the passion would be the last thing you think about at night is taking pictures. The first thing in the morning you think about is taking pictures. So there are trade-offs to that. That unfortunately you give up a lot of everything. The bad news is there's a lot of sad things that you miss that I regret. The good news is you build what you have. You build the ability to do books, exhibitions, galleries, museums, and so on. So there's a trade-off there. But the passion, and also sometimes my son once said to me when he saw me working for a day, he said, he said, are you enjoying this? And I said, no, I love it. He said, not so sure you look like you're enjoying it. And sometimes the intensity does that. I try to have fun with people, I love teasing people and stuff like that. But you don't have to do what I did. You don't have to end up doing hundreds of record sleeve covers and movie posters or Vogue covers and exhibitions. You don't have to. You can be quite a fantastic photographer but be much more intimate with your work and quieter and produce your work in private, and maybe you don't shoot for a month and then you do shoot and so on. I always found it beneficial to be shooting, working, shooting, working, shooting, working. I mean, you always, if you remember, the best example of this is, and there's many examples of this, many examples, but the best example of the Beatles, and the Beatles hit in Britain in 63, beginning of 63. And they seemed so good. They had the ability to write songs, even pop songs in the beginning, but they had this fantastic cohesion, the four people, sort of, you know, especially three of them, the George Harrison, Paul and John, and then you say, wow, how did they get so good so quickly? But then when you eventually look at the anthology, you begin to see pictures of them in late 58.
Yeah.
And 59 is the quarrymen on the back of a truck playing. And then you realize that they had done intensive work, touring work, Hamburg, et cetera, working like dogs, really. They would do, they said, 4 sets a day in Hamburg. And then it was night in, night out, 7 days a week. And that's how they got like that. The slog, as I call it, the slog. And that's how you get to be like them. And I'm not saying I'm like the Beatles, not at all. I'm just saying it's the slog make you better. You know, the slog makes you better.
We have that's a great answer and a great question. I think all of us have to apply our own dynamic to that. But I've got a question, Albert, from, I'm not going to pronounce it right, Snigdha Leela, who's asking you, where do you get your inspiration from? Also, when do you think, did you make it? Yes, I'm going to interpret, in other words, let's say you're doing a picture. How do you know at that moment, I've got the picture? The Steve Jobs story maybe is a good example of that. But is there a moment when the light bulb goes on and says, I've got it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is. Now, inspiration, if you look just behind me here, yeah, this is a fraction of that. And I want to give a very good tip to the photographers.
Please.
Here. Online, you can find Sotheby's, Christie's, Phillips, photography catalogs, auction catalogs. And you can sometimes, I found a bunch of them recently, 5 for $30.
Wow.
Okay, 5 catalogs, $30. Now, a lot of the catalogs have 280 images in them. So for $30, you buy a book, but it's 5 books of catalogs. And the wonderful thing about these is there's photographs there from 1880. There's photographs in from 1980, 2000, and can be 2010, 2015.
Wow.
So you have right at your fingertips a massive amount of, you can find these on eBay. You put photography catalogs, Christie's, and you can find these things. And they're not expensive. It's not like me recommending a book by Taschen that costs $600. It's not like that. It's cheap. It's a fabulous way of getting, when you're trying to discover yourself and looking for inspiration, books like that. Now, for inspiration, theater, music, movies. I mean, the internet. My God, young people today, we never had that. Yeah. Go to the movies, it was 1 movie a week because that's all you could afford. Right. Now, you kind of go into things for anything. You join Spotify for nothing, and you can pull up 800 classical albums. I mean, it's just, it's almost like overwhelming.
Yeah.
But as for inspiration, all of these things, art, museums, you know, books, and seeing, working. Now it's even easier for, my first thing, I think I mentioned to you, Michael, was that our photography class, of which there were 6 of us, we only had 1 camera. So in other words, what do you mean you didn't have a camera? I mean, young people today wouldn't understand that. Right. You didn't have a camera because it cost money, you know, and you didn't, and so you would get this camera for 3 days with 2 rolls of film, 36 exposures, 72 frames. That was it. Now you didn't get that camera again for another 5 weeks, 6 weeks. Then you got the camera again. You know, was it like 4 weeks later, you might get it. And then you got another 2. So you had to be economical. Now, digital cameras, you can just go out and take pictures, take them on your iPhone, take hundreds of pictures and so on. The iPhone, I would recommend, unless students want to make iPhone their life, the camera on an iPhone, I mean, on their life, I would recommend I use it for references. Yeah. And to be honest, the main thing on my phone is that when I'm looking at books and I find something in a book or on an internet screen, I put it on my phone because then I have it in my pocket. Yeah. So I have that. So inspiration is like that. How do I know I've got the shot? I think that's just an instinct thing. You have to just say experience and instinct. And I think when I spoke to you earlier, I gave you the example. Early on in my career, when I was in LA right at the beginning, and I mentioned this to you, you take a shot on Monday and you go, my God, this is better than any picture Richard Avedon ever did. And then on Tuesday, the film comes back and you go, wait a minute, it doesn't look as good as I remember it. And then on Wednesday, you throw it out. So going from Monday, Sistine Chapel, Richard Avedon, get to Wednesday, right? And you're throwing the picture out. So what's the breakdown there? Where did the brain fail? What you were so excited on Monday, you're not excited at all now. And a lot of the time is experience, a lot of the time technical. You know, it's technical.
Albert, don't you think 5 years later you might come back to the Wednesday and go, you know what, that was a great picture, but my mindset changed? You certainly have utilized work you've done through the years, repurposed it, changed it, and layered it. So I think we have that option too, don't you?
We do, but I think at that time, a lot of the early pictures were really kind of, I don't like a lot of the early pictures. Aaron, my son, who manages a lot of the galleries and museums, I sometimes get into heated arguments about that because I find that the early pictures have sometimes a lack sometimes. Now, sometimes I was lucky with the early pictures, like the Hitchcock. That was a fairly early picture. Yeah. And some fashion early on. There's actually some pictures that you can find from back then that are not bad. That are quite good, but there's a lot that are not, yeah. You know, and you want to just throw those out. You know, and of course, then Aaron he doesn't want me destroying these negatives around it.
Absolutely. I've got a very good question. It's very relevant to some things you talked about before, Albert. It's from Calvin Scott, and he's asking, how has the current pandemic affected your clients' demands and your workflow? You answered partly this. And how do you expect the photography industry to change post quarantine?
Well, there is no business right now. Everything is shut down. And there's a minimal amount of work going on in parts of Europe that are not so heavily done, but New York is shut down. I mean, the studio complexes here are shut down. The studio I mentioned has 12 studios there, they're shut down. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm using this time at my studio. We started working again last week. We're going from 1 day last week, 1 day this week, and then 2 days next week, then 2 days, and then 3 days, and so on. So we'll build it back up again in the studio. But there is no demand right now. No, everybody I speak to is sitting at home. Yeah. So, I mean, so that's a massive effect. I mean, I don't know how magazines will do it, whether they'll use existing shootings or if they're going to shoot it all in a studio quickly or how they're going to do it. I'm not sure about that.
Albert, I've got one last question from one of our wonderful SCAD professor from Savannah, Jenny Kula. She's asking, your images of Kate Moss remind me a bit of Weston's collaboration with Charis Wilson. Are there any particular mid-century photographers who have been an influence on you?
The biggest influence in the very beginning was a combination. really of Avedon and pen,
Yeah.
which is fairly normal. I love pen because he printed his own work. Avedon was not a printer. Everything was sent out, and
Right.
he would mark up ridiculously, I always thought. He would,
Touch and
he had no interest in it. It was a weird kind of thing. And when you can go to one of his books and it shows you him marking up prints for a printer, and he would always put 20% more here, 30% more there, 40%, 10% less here, and so on. I was always amazed by this. And I actually said to him, because I knew him, and I said to him, I said it was quite funny, your markings on the prints. He said, what was wrong with it? I said, well, it was never 32%. It was always a round number, you know? And then he said, well, I wanted to make it easy for the printers, you know? The guy who was in the darkroom with the paper, you know? And of course, people who print a lot know that sometimes it's 17 seconds, you know, more. It's not, or 12 and a half seconds, even if you want to get funny about it. But I would say that they were a big influence, the combination of the two of them. They were marvelous, marvelous photographers. I think 5,000 other photographers before them, from Rodchenko to, you know, Cartier-Bresson, who's nothing like my work, but I was fascinated by it. I often would want to go out and take a picture after looking at a book of Cartier-Bresson, not to do a picture like Cartier-Bresson, it just was inspiring. Let me take a picture quickly. Weston, amazing. I love the period he was with Tina Midori down in Mexico. You know, amazing.
Yeah, they're incredible pictures too, Albert. Unfortunately, we have to stop. I can't thank you enough for doing this. The students are going to be firing questions at us all week from their computers while they're safely quarantined. And I can't thank you enough for this. I want to also thank everybody at SCAD for making this possible, for the series of Gus and Gusto. Albert, I hope you'll be back. We're going to have to ask you a lot more questions. We didn't get a chance to look at the Out of Sky. I want to do that next time because those are beautiful pictures. But on behalf of everybody, thank you so much.
Well, it was a pleasure.
Doing this.
Questions were very good. I love the questions.
Well, they were great. I got 10 more, but we don't have time in this moment. Well, I'll send them to you. And stay safe and keep working and producing all these amazing images. They're inspiring all of us.
Everybody should stay safe.
Yeah, we are. We definitely are.
Thank the team.
Thank you, SCAD. Thank you, Gus and Gusto.